As people across Southern California and Nevada currently shelter in place for a massive tropical storm, everyone from the beach to the high desert is bracing themselves for severe flooding. This isn't the first time something like this has happened on the southern Pacific coast. What began as Hurricane Hilary off the coast of Baja California was to be the first hurricane to hit Southern California since 1858. It was downgraded to a tropical storm as it hit land, but authorities still expect catastrophic flooding. This reminds me of what I've read about the Great Flood of 1862. That megastorm hit the west coast like a ton of bricks, from the Washington Territory down to Mexico, and as far inland as Utah. It also interrupted this little drama called the Civil War, which was about to turn hot in the Pacific Theater. The Great Flood of 1862 started as a series of winter storms in the fall of 1861. From the Pacific Northwest down to the San Gabriel and San Bernardino Mountains, the snow came early. As early as November, onlookers were witnessing a foot of snow falling at lower altitudes than usual, and they saw it really coming down on the mountains above them. Then it started raining, and the rain continued to come down, alternating with heavy snowfall in the mountains. The snow fell the hardest on Oregon and the Washington Territory. These areas started flooding a month earlier than the rest of the areas that would get hit. A wave of warm tropical winds swept over Oregon, causing the snow to melt a few months early. The melting snow, combined with heavy rain, caused the areas around the Cascade Range to flood in the beginning of December 1861. The Willamette River in northern Oregon flooded and formed new tributaries. On December 3rd, the Willamette River flood reached Salem. On December 4th, the flood hit Oregon City. The next day, the floodwaters swept through Clackamas County. 3 days later, Albany was flooded, and the rains continued. The Oregon City Argus reported on December 14th. Tuesday evening, a gloom settled on a scene such as probably never was witnessed in our valley before. The ceaseless roar of the stream made a fearful elemental music widely different from the ordinary monotone of the falls, while the darkness was only made more visible by the glare of torches and hurrying lights, which, with the shouts of people from the windows of houses surrounded by water, all conspired to render the hour one of intense and painful excitement. The flood has covered the highest mark of January 53 and is still rapidly rising. As late as anything could be seen, the mills were still standing, but the insatiate monster is still creeping up, inch by inch, winding its swelling folds around the pillars and foundations of all the houses in its way, crushing and grinding them in the maw of destruction, and sweeping the broken fragments into a common vortex of ruin. All night as on the night previous, people whose homes were being invaded hurried to places of security, glad to escape even with the sacrifice of all their goods. Now that is terrifying. At least during daytime hours, people could see the flood, but at night, before electricity and streetlights, people couldn't see a thing. And it's raining, so there's not even moonlight. They could only hear the roar of the floodwaters rising. Lynn City, Champaoueg, and Orleans were completely destroyed, and the storm reached hundreds of miles inland. In eastern Washington, present-day Idaho, the Columbia River flooded to historic levels. That flood, combined with heavy snowfall in the mountains, cut off the roads and all communication for the small towns and mining camps along the Salmon River. Hundreds of miners were stranded in the mountains for months and began to starve. In California, the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys were flooded. By the end of December, there was a lake 300 miles long, 20 miles wide, and 30 feet deep covering these valleys. Sacramento City was hit especially hard. There was a large levee on the west side of the city built to protect the population from ocean flooding. The city planners never imagined that they'd be flooded from the east by water running down from the Sierra Nevada. With the flooding coming from the east, the levee held the floodwater inside the city. The city of Sacramento effectively became Atlantis, with the water levels 10 feet higher inside the city than on the west side of the levee. Residents rode boats on the streets of downtown Sacramento, and the waters did not recede for several months. As late as January 10, 1862, California's newly elected governor, Leland Stanford, had to take a rowboat to the Capital District to be sworn in. One eyewitness wrote, "I was a passenger on the old steamer Gem from Sacramento to Red Bluff. The only way the pilot could tell where the channel of the river was by the cottonwood trees on each side of the river. The boat had to stop several times and take men out of the tops of trees and off the roofs of houses. In our trip up the river, we met property of every description floating down. Dead horses and cattle, sheep, hogs, houses, haystacks, household furniture, and everything imaginable was on its way for the ocean. Arriving at Red Bluff, there was water everywhere as far as the eye could reach, and what few bridges there had been in the county were all swept away. In Los Angeles County on the Pacific coast, the LA, San Gabriel, and Santa Ana rivers all flooded and then merged, creating an inland sea 18 miles wide. Farther inland, in San Bernardino County, the Santa Ana River completely destroyed the town of Aguamansa near present-day Colton, and all traces of that settlement were washed away. In northern San Diego County, the huge sandy depression called the Salton Sink also flooded, creating an inland sea that was 60 miles long. A few miles north, in the Mojave Desert, Owens Valley was also devastated by floods. The Paiute people suffered greatly, as most of the game animals they depended on for food were drowned and washed away. This caused a famine for the natives, driving them in desperation to send raiding parties to the white settlements to poach cattle for food. The miners and ranchers didn't take kindly to the poaching, and these circumstances directly led to the Owens Valley Indian War of 1862 and 1863. In the Nevada Territory, residents noted a solid month of snowfall starting on December 24th. By the end of January, the Carson River Basin was flooded, and the mining towns of Dayton and Aurora took heavy damage. Next door, in the Utah Territory, the towns of Adventure and Northrop were destroyed by the flood. St. George, Utah was almost destroyed, but there were still a few buildings left standing on high ground by February 1862. Further south, on California's border with the New Mexico Territory and Confederate Arizona, riverside communities were also broadsided by the weather. The Colorado River flooded and rose high above its banks. The soldiers at Fort Yuma must have been terrified as they watched the Colorado River rise higher and higher. Normally, Fort Yuma sat on slightly higher ground on the river's east bank. Throughout January, the waters rose steadily until they reached their peak at 1 o'clock in the morning on January 23rd. Remember, all they had for light were torches and oil lamps. Assuming the heavy rain didn't just extinguish their torches and lamps, they would have had just enough light to see their immediate vicinity in camp, but nothing else. They couldn't see the river rising at night. They could only hear it. By January 23rd, the Colorado River extended around the fort's high ground, turning Fort Yuma into an island. The nearby riverside communities of Yeager City and Colorado City, just south of the fort, were completely destroyed and washed away. Camped out near the Colorado River was a very frustrated Union Army Colonel, James Carleton, whose pending invasion of Confederate Arizona was physically impossible. The Great Flood of 1862 must have seemed like a godsend to the rebel territorial government in Arizona. Not only was the Colorado River impassable, but the Gila River also flooded, washing away much of the hay and grains that were being secretly prepared by pro-Union contractors to sustain the California column. Even after the floodwaters started receding in February, the roads from Yuma to Tucson were a giant mud puddle, totally impassable by horse or stagecoach. This delay of the California column's incursion into Confederate Arizona gave the territorial governor, Colonel John Baylor, enough time to deploy 50 men from Company A of the Arizona Cavalry Battalion to Tucson under the command of Captain Sherrod Hunter, and they arrived in late February. Whereas the Yankees had hoped to surprise the rebels in western Arizona, it was now guaranteed that they wouldn't even approach Tucson without a fight. This would be the most devastating flood for the West Coast until the 1940s. So yes, you could say that the weather impacted the Civil War in the Pacific Theater. Thank you for watching the Civil War Wild West Edition. Please hit like and subscribe because it really does help out this channel. And if you want more Civil War content, you can check out these other documentaries that we've got ready for you. Stay safe and stay dry.